Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 613. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. Today, joined by co-host Connor Freeman. Connor, how you doing, buddy?
Doing very well, Kyle. How are you?
Doing well, Connor. Happy to have you on today. We got quite a bit of news to get through, so I want to jump right into it. Just want to remind people to share the show. It's hosted on the Libertarian Institute. You can find the show on the blog at antiwar.com, YouTube, Rumble, or Odysee for the video version of the show. It's up anywhere you can listen to audio podcasts. And of course, you can follow the show on Twitter at con_interest. Connor, let's get into it today. I just have two stories that I want to talk about. This one from our colleague Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. U.S. lifts ban on arming and training Ukrainian neo-Nazi Azov Brigade. So the State Department on Monday announced that it had formally lifted a ban on arming and training the Azov Brigade, an infamous Ukrainian neo-Nazi military unit. The Azov Brigade celebrated the news, saying the eligibility for U.S. assistance will not only increase the Azov Battalion's combat effectiveness. This is a new package in the history of our unit. Azov is becoming more professional and more effective in defending Ukraine against the invaders, the Azov Battalion wrote on X. The Azov Brigade was founded as a militia in 2014, known as the Azov Battalion, to fight the Ukrainian separatists in the Donbass, and was later absorbed into the Ukrainian National Guard. The military unit's founder, Andrei Biletsky, is known for his neo-Nazi and white supremacist rhetoric. In 2014, he was also the leader of the ultra-nationalist organization known as the Social National Assembly, SNA, which dissolved in 2015. The BBC reported in 2014 that SNA wrote an online publication that aimed to prepare Ukraine for the further expansion and to struggle for the liberation of the entire white race from the domination of the internationalist speculative capital. The group also thought to punish severely sexual perversions and any interracial contacts that lead to the extinction of the white man. So the founder of the Azov Brigade was elected to the Ukrainian parliament in 2014, and he later left Azov due to a ban on elected officials serving in the military. He became a leader of the National Corps Party in 2016, which he still leads today, but he did lose his seat in parliament in 2019. Supporters of the Azov Brigade have tried to rebrand the military unit and distance itself from its founder, but the regiment still uses the Wolf's Angel symbol, which was associated with the neo-Nazi ideology, and its current leader was associated widely with the Azov movement going back to 2014. So this is a Ukrainian-American journalist reporting for CNN in 2022. The current leader of the Azov Regiment, Denis Redis Porkinko, is a part of the core Azov movement since 2014 and has served under commanders who went on to lead the Azov movement, political and street wings. The reporter said, U.S. assistance to Azov was banned in an amendment to the 2018 National Defense Authorization Act. So Representative Ro Kahana said in 2018, when the bill became law, white supremacy and neo-Nazism are unacceptable and have no place in our world. I am very pleased that we recently passed the omnibus prevents the U.S. from providing arms and training and assistance to the neo-Nazi Azov Battalion fighting in Ukraine. The State Department claimed on Monday that Azov passed vetting under the Leahy laws, which prohibits military aid going to units that have committed human rights abuses. The State Department said after thorough review, Ukraine's 12th Special Forces Azov Brigade passed Leahy vetting as carried out by the U.S. Department of State. U.S. military equipment has ended up in the hands of other neo-Nazi-linked groups in Ukraine, including the Russian Volunteer Corps, a militia made up of pro-Ukrainian Russian-born fighters, some being Azov veterans. The RVC has used U.S. armored vehicles in raids on Russian territory. So, Connor, that's, I mean, just horrific that this is what we're doing. And of course, it's so huge that we had all this moral panic about how Trump was going to usher in the Nazi movement into America. And here you let Joe Biden, this kindly old fool, and suddenly you have the U.S. being willing to arm Nazis in Ukraine and do it openly. So, one more article here. This is another one from Dave DeCamp, antiwar.com, June 10th. U.S. wants to create hellscape of drones if China attacks Taiwan. The U.S. is planning to create a quote hellscape of drones in the Taiwan Strait if China moves to attack Taiwan, the U.S. top military commander in the region has told the Washington Post. This is Admiral Samuel Papero, and he is the head of U.S. Pacific Command, Indo-Pacific Command, and he told the Washington Post columnist Josh Rogan that the idea would be to send thousands of drones, unmanned submarines, and drone boats into the strait to buy time for the U.S. and Taiwan to prepare for defense of the island. He said, I want to turn the Taiwan Strait into an unmanned hellscape using a number of classified capabilities so that I can make their lives utterly miserable for a month, which buys me time for the rest of everything. And Connor, I grew up watching Terminator 2, one of my favorite movies as a kid, and this kind of stuff absolutely terrifies me. To have this level of coordination of drones and armored drones, and they talk about we're going to have to use this in the Taiwan Strait, but of course this technology is going to be replicated. Eventually, it's going to find its way into the hands of police forces, and then we're going to have just networks of drones and unmanned different vehicles and little robo dog cops and all kinds of stuff walking our streets and terrorizing us. I mean, this is, again, it goes first to escalating with the Taiwan Strait, and who knows, Connor, maybe fortunately we don't have to worry about that and they get us into a nuclear war over Taiwan and we're all dead before the robo dogs start dominating our streets. But the other possibility is, of course, is if we never go to war with China, that this technology does trickle down back home and it ends up, costing all of us a lot of our freedoms. So the U.S. has taken steps in the direction of developing swarms of drones for a future war with China. Last year, Deputy Secretary of Defense Kathleen Hitz outlined a plan to deploy thousands of drones controlled by artificial intelligence known as the Receptacator Initiative. She said, with Receptacator, we're beginning all domain attributable autonomy, or ADA2, to help us overcome the People Republics of China's advantage in mass, more ships, more missiles, more forces. Hitz said in a press conference in September of 2023. She added that the U.S. plans to deploy the drones at a scale of multiple of thousands in multiple domains and within the next 18 to 24 months. And Connor, when they say things like this, I'm sure there are, at least, I'm not saying that the Chinese government is saying that, oh, this means we have to attack Taiwan, but there certainly are people within the Chinese government who I'm sure go up to Xi and they say, look here, the Americans are planning to do this and they're going to have this technology in 2 years. We should act sooner rather than later. And so, again, not that they're going to listen to this, but I'm sure this kind of threat adds a lot of fuel to the hawkish fire within Beijing, which I'm sure does exist in some halls of the CCP, that, people who really do want to take a more aggressive approach to retake Taiwan. So the head of U.S. Indo-Pacific Command framed the plan as necessary to deter China from attacking Taiwan, but the U.S. military buildup in the region and its support for Taiwan has only raised tensions and is making a conflict more likely. The admiral also used Cold War-style language when discussing the situation in the Asia-Pacific, saying regional countries need to make a choice between the U.S. and China. So he said the region has two good choices. The first is they can submit and, as a end result, give up some of their freedoms, or they can arm to the teeth. Both cases have direct implications for the security, freedom, and well-being of citizens of the United States of America. And, Connor, as funny as it is that we have these coots that are somewhat leading our government in our decision making, it's also kind of terrifying that they view the world as this zero-sum game where, it's either us or China, and if we don't go one way, then we go the other way, and all Americans' freedoms are in jeopardy, and all this other insanity. So, Connor, let me hand it over to you here. I know you got a couple articles on the Middle East that you want to go through on today's show.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is kind of a false dichotomy. The American people have submitted to people like Paparo and Hicks, and we've lost almost all of our freedoms, and we're still armed to the teeth with military weaponry and, of course, these new drones. So It's interesting to see John Aquilino is no longer running Indo-Pacific Command, but it looks like they're going in the exact same direction. I mean, this is a guy who was saying earlier on in the Biden administration that he's been tasked not by Congress, but by the president and his boss, Lloyd Austin, from the Raytheon Board of Directors, to you have two jobs. One, to prevent a war between China and Taiwan. But if you fail, then go to war with China, fight it, and win it. And he said, he was boasting that we're prepared, to execute that war and to accomplish mission two, or task two, or however he phrased it. But yes, Aquilino was extremely reckless and provocative, and of course his position was that there would never be any sort of decrease in the military footprint in the South China Sea and elsewhere in China's near abroad and their neighborhood, and that he didn't care if it meant that there was going to be a higher risk of escalation or accident or miscalculation that would lead to a potential direct conflict with China. He was asked about this at a particular forum that I had covered that seeks more peace and engagement between the two largest economies in the world. And his position was, no, that's our position, is we're going to stay here. We're going to expand. And if China wants war, then they can have it. And of course, that's that is clearly what the bipartisan consensus is. And across all the military branches is that it's a foregone conclusion. We're going to war with China. It's just a question of not if, but when. Okay, so the good news is we were very rarely reporting good news on this show, but I do have a poll here. This was written up at the Cradle about a YouGov and CBS News poll that shows that the majority of U.S. citizens reject arming Israel. And this comes on the heels of a poll that was conducted back in March by Gallup that showed that a majority of Americans, I believe 55%, disapprove of Israeli military actions in the Gaza Strip. So, despite the fact that we don't see any real shift within the Congress, the American people are becoming frustrated and furious about the trajectory of American Middle East policy, and notably as it pertains to Israel and its war on Palestine, or I should say Washington's war on Palestine as well. Okay, so the article says the majority of U.S. citizens say the U.S. government should not send weapons to Israel, but should send humanitarian aid to Gaza instead. And this is, again, a poll published on the 7th of June by CBS News and YouGov. So the poll asks, quote, regarding the situation with Israel and Hamas, which one of these should the U.S. do or not do now? And 61% of U.S. citizens responded, saying the U.S. should not send weapons to Israel. Among Democrats, 77% said the U.S. should not send weapons, compared to just 38% of Republicans. At the same time, 62% of American citizens say that Washington should send humanitarian aid to Palestinians in Gaza, while only 38% opposed it. So the poll highlights the weak influence of U.S. public opinion and the strong influence of the Israel lobby and pro-Israel U.S. officials over U.S. foreign policy. Despite strong opposition from voters in his own Democratic Party, President Biden has prioritized sending unprecedented amounts of weapons to Israel since the start of its war on Gaza on the 7th of October last year. So the Cradle quotes a former U.S. Army officer speaking with the New York Times saying, what the U.S. started to do almost immediately was send an extraordinary flow of weapons. The Times added that, quote, there were so many arms shipments to Israel that a senior Pentagon official said the Department of Defense sometimes struggled to find sufficient cargo aircraft to deliver them. And that, according to the Times piece, came from a report from the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, which is the most powerful, notorious, arch neocon, anti-Iran think tank, very closely tied with the Israeli, the Likudnik establishment in D.C. And Biden's Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, of course, has played a vital role as well in advancing weapons deliveries to Tel Aviv. After the war began, he expressed solidarity with Israel as someone of the Jewish faith, the Jerusalem Post reported. Blinken, once he got there for the first visit, said, I come to you not only as the United States Secretary of State, but also as a Jew, as if that is any part of the job description for being America's top diplomat in a situation like this, obviously already showing, as he has before with infamous quotes like, I inherited my Zionism and so forth, that Blinken has very clearly chosen a position on this war and is one of the most ardent hawks, of course, in the administration. And so in April, only 37 Democrats and 21 Republicans voted against the bill to provide military aid to Israel, which, of course, on top of the $3.8 billion that was passed earlier in our annual forced American taxpayer giveaway to the world's most notorious apartheid state. This added about another $17 billion. So at least $20 billion plus another $6 billion ostensibly going towards humanitarian aid to, paper over or give some sort of token assistance to some of these populations and areas that have been decimated. But again, we're still paying for Israel's war, even when it comes to those kinds of expenses. And a large majority, 173 members in total, voted to approve the bill. Support for Israel from members of Congress from both political parties is strong in large part due to the pro-Israel lobby, most notably AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee. And in a recent interview with Tucker Carlson, Republican Congressman Thomas Massie said that every Republican member of Congress has a, quote, AIPAC babysitter, who is assigned to advise them on issues concerning support for Israel. Massie said, I've had 4 members of Congress say, well, I'll talk to my AIPAC person. It's really what we call them. It's my AIPAC guy. So AIPAC and other Israel lobby groups also provide significant funding for election and re-election campaigns. In April, AIPAC announced it was committing $100 million to defeat a handful of Democratic congressional candidates in this fall's elections who had expressed criticism of Israel's war on Gaza, which has so far killed over 15,000 children and is widely viewed as a genocide. The efforts of AIPAC and the rest of the Israel lobby far outweigh efforts by Arab and Jewish activists who oppose U.S. support for Israel's war in Gaza, and certainly have much more of a stronghold on our ostensible representatives in the Congress. But, of course, polling like this and the mass demonstrations that have been ongoing since October 7th here in the U.S. opposing the war on Gaza and the broader attacks on Palestinians and ethnic cleansing and murders taking place, mass murders taking place in the West Bank, have been very encouraging. And of course, I think these repeated evidence from these public opinion polls for whatever they're worth, I think indicate that we're seeing a huge impact from social media platforms like TikTok that are not under the control of the American ruling class, and so of course that has to be shut down. That push was spearheaded by the Israel lobby, by by Blinken's own admission, or excuse me, Mitt Romney's own admission, as well as other politicians, that this is really Israel that pushed for this, because of course it's staggering when you look at the data on the disparity in pro-Palestinian content on TikTok versus posts that are supportive of the Israeli campaign. I mean, they're outpaced by the billions. And, of course, this is what is leading so many people, the independent media, but also, as I said, TikTok, just the evidence and the constant plethora of footage and images coming out showing the American people firsthand what the U.S. war machine looks like. I mean, the American people should not be at war with the Palestinians, one of the most defenseless and poor populations in the world, militarily conquered and dominated by the Israeli apartheid state since 1967, longer than the Soviet Union ruled Eastern Europe. And now we can just watch this slaughter taking place every single day, with American bombs being dropped on Palestinian hospitals and schools and homes and civilian apartment buildings and refugee camps and UN shelters and aid convoys and aid personnel and facilities and all the rest of it, not to mention all of the agricultural land. The American people just cannot believe that their government is complicit in a genocide like this, and I think that's why we're seeing these kinds of effects. And so hopefully at some point it does begin to pose a threat to the Israel lobby's hold on Washington. Okay, so this next story, Israel destroyed half of Gaza's buildings, and this is coming from the UN. And this is also right up at the cradle, but I've also included some notes from another article where this data was analyzed at the Palestine Chronicle, which is Ramzi Baroud's site, who's our resident Palestinian columnist at antiwar.com. And so The article says the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian Refugees, that's UNRWA, said on June 10th that Israel's aggression in the Gaza Strip has destroyed over half the buildings in the besieged enclave. The destruction of Gaza is indescribable, the UN body said via a social media post. More than half of all buildings have been destroyed. UNRWA continues to say that, quote, clearing the rubble will take years. Healing from the psychological trauma of this war will take even longer. The UN separately noted that Israel's bombing of Gaza targeted over 180 of their buildings alone, killing at least 400 people sheltering under the UN banner. Now, earlier in May, the UN Development Program stated that repairing the enclave would take roughly 80 years. And so the Palestine Chronicle notes include, in addition to the destroyed buildings, clearing Gaza of unexploded bombs could take up to 14 years, UN demining experts have said. Pierre Lodemar, a senior officer from the UN Mine Action Service, said in April that Israel's war on Gaza since October 7th has left an estimated 37 million tons of debris. Quote, all I can say is that at least 10% of the ammunition that is being fired potentially fails to function. With 100 trucks, we're talking about 14 years of work with 100 trucks. So that's 14 years to remove with about 750,000 person workdays to remove the debris, Lahodamar explained. Now, Abdullah al-Dardari, the Assistant Secretary General and Director of the UN Development Program Regional Bureau for Arab States, told The National that these construction efforts may cost upwards of $40 billion. And that's obviously money that the Palestinians don't have. Quote, some donors have to be aware that they will have to take a risk by investing a little bit of money, Dardari said. That's why we said, let's have $2 billion at first, a process that allows us to provide a dignified livelihood for up to 1 million Palestinians. That will push the number up to 3 billion, but still it's within reasonable means. He later told the Emirati news agency, we are faced with a dilemma, but no one is willing to invest big amounts of money in Gaza before they see a serious, credible peace process. But to see a serious, credible peace process, again, we don't know what that would take. Now, the UN Development Program says that over 70% of Gazan homes have been destroyed over a span of 6 months, and that figure could reach 80 to 90% as the war continues. Over 1 million Palestinians have now fled Rafah. You know, before the attack and the seizure of the crossing with Egypt on May 7th, roughly 1.5 million people were sheltering there. I just saw a report from Middle East Eye on their wire that keeps track of everything happening related to the war, that there's 100,000 people or less remaining in Rafah now. So, you know, over 1 million people at least have fled. They're seeking shelter from bombardment and are now forced to return to the ruins of their former homes following Israel's assault on the southernmost city that started in May. And again, the Palestine Chronicle writes that according to Gaza's Ministry of Health, 37,124 Palestinians have been killed and 84,712 have been wounded. Moreover, at least 11,000 people are unaccounted for, presumed dead under the rubble of their homes throughout the Strip. Palestinian and international organizations say that the majority of those killed and wounded are women and children. The Israeli war has resulted in an acute famine, mostly in northern Gaza, resulting in the death of many Palestinians, again, mostly children. So speaking of the peace process, this next story, Israel perpetrated Nuseirat massacre to block ceasefire deal. And this comes from Ismail Haniyeh, the head of Hamas's political bureau. So this is from June 10th at the Cradle. Ismail Haniyeh says that Israel launched its bloody massacre and captive rescue operation in Gaza's Nuseirat camp Saturday to block a ceasefire deal. And speaking with Al Jazeera Arabic on June 10th about the U.S. proposed ceasefire deal and prospects for ending the war, Haniyeh said that Israel attacked the Nuseirat camp, killing at least 274 Palestinians and retrieving 4 Israeli captives to block any agreement that would end the war. Now, Israeli forces bombed various civilian areas of Gaza from the air to create chaos and pave the way for Saturday's operation, while executing Palestinians in cold blood in their homes where no Israeli captives were present. Haniyeh also accused the U.S. of being a part of the attack, saying the Biden White House is, quote, no less criminal than the Israeli leadership. Now, a video posted by an Israeli soldier showed the captives being extracted by helicopter from the beach in Gaza, where the U.S. built its floating port, according to allegedly to deliver humanitarian aid. Although we know from reporting in Israeli media, the Jerusalem Post, and also from the Khan broadcaster, that Apparently the floating pier was an idea originally proposed by Netanyahu to the president of Cyprus back in October, and I believe in March, speaking to a Knesset committee on foreign affairs and security, Netanyahu suggested that the pier itself could be used to remove Palestinians from Gaza to facilitate the ethnic cleansing campaign, and so the So on Sunday, we have Jake Sullivan saying that the U.S. offered help with the rescue of the 4 Israeli captives, but he did not specify how, citing security reasons. Now, a senior White House official told NBC News on Monday that the operation will likely complicate efforts to reach a ceasefire and captive exchange between Israel and Hamas. The freeing of the 4 Israeli captives, quote, has strengthened Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's determination to continue pursuing military operations rather than agreeing to a ceasefire deal, the official said. And before Saturday's massacre, the U.S. had been pushing Israeli officials to accept a ceasefire proposal announced by President Biden on May 31st. U.S. officials claim that Israel put forward the proposal, but Netanyahu and other ministers in his government have stated that they would refuse any deal that would force them to permanently end their 7-month bombing and demolition campaign in the besieged Gaza Strip. Hamas has insisted that any ceasefire deal must lead to a permanent end to the war. On Monday, Secretary of State Blinken visited Cairo and then Tel Aviv, allegedly to renew the push for a ceasefire deal, although I find that very specious. He will visit Amman and Doha next. Blinken specifically seeks support for the latest draft of the ceasefire deal presented by Biden. The U.S. also hopes to put the proposal to a vote at the UN Security Council. And of course, this vote already took place, and it was approved in a vote of, 14 yes votes, and I believe only Russia abstained because they said it's not clear what Israel is agreeing to, which is, of course, true, and that the wording is quite vague. A senior Hamas official, Sami Abu Zuhri, urged the U.S. on Monday to pressure Israel to end the war. He says, "We call upon the U.S. administration to put pressure on the occupation to stop the war on Gaza, and the Hamas movement is ready to deal positively with any initiative that secures an end to the war." And so my understanding is that Hamas is not officially, as Dave DeCamp has noted at antiwar.com, they've not officially responded to Biden's proposal, but they were encouraged by the passing of the resolution at the Security Council, and is expressed that they put out a statement saying that they're ready to engage in indirect negotiations on the principles. And so that's a very good sign. Of course, there is a rift taking place currently in the Israeli war cabinet. We just saw Benny Gantz leave the emergency government over this issue of whether or not the fact that Netanyahu has not put forward any kind of a proposal about what is to be done with Gaza in sort of a post-conflict governance. I believe Gantz supports a sort of U.S., European, Arab, Palestinian coalition that would manage civil affairs while Israel retains permanent security control in Gaza, which would, of course, be an indefinite occupation akin to the West Bank, and would likely be even more nightmarish than what we're seeing going on in the West Bank right now. But Netanyahu can't possibly agree to that for various political reasons. He wants to remain in power, and it appears, unfortunately, that Netanyahu is even close to just starting a war with an outright full-scale war with Hezbollah and Lebanon in order to avoid having to even address this pressure that's being imposed on him at this point. It's too little too late. But of course, Israel doesn't have to abide by international law or any dictates by the UN Security Council, as long as the U.S. is protecting them. And so, but it does look like Netanyahu is ready to escalate with Lebanon. And that brings us to this next story from Al Jazeera: Israel white phosphorus attacks on Lebanon harming people and ecosystem. So, as Al Jazeera reported in March, and this is from Justin Salhani from June 9th. So he writes, as Al Jazeera reported in March, Israel continues to use white phosphorus munitions in South Lebanon, causing lasting damage and driving villagers away, even as Israeli officials threaten a war across their northern border. A new report released Wednesday by Human Rights Watch concurs, showing that white phosphorus attacks are, quote, putting civilians at grave risk and contributing to displacement. More than 92,600 people have been displaced from their villages in South Lebanon since October 6th, according to the International Organization for Migration. Israel's use of airburst white phosphorus munitions in populated areas indiscriminately harms civilians and has led many to leave their homes, Ramzi Kais, a Lebanon researcher at Human Rights Watch, says in the report. In their investigation, Human Rights Watch also verified the use of white phosphorus munitions by the Israeli military in at least 17 municipalities across South Lebanon since October of last year, when Israel's war on Gaza began. They verified the illegal use of airburst munitions over populated residential areas in municipalities of Kafr Kila, Mis al Jabal, Bustain, Markaba, and Aita al Shab. And white phosphorus injuries can be severely painful and necrotic. Oxides can reignite in the skin unless the burns are covered immediately and kept covered to prevent any exposure to oxygen. Other symptoms may include severe respiratory problems, acute lung injury, severe eye damage, second or third degree burns, or even severe bone diseases, such as the necrotic Lucifer's jaw, as it's known. At least 173 people have been injured by exposure to white phosphorus between October and late May, according to Lebanon's Ministry of Public Health. Among those are verified cases of civilians who were rushed to a hospital on October 15th for asphyxiation after coming in contact with the white phosphorus. And reported cases of white phosphorus continued into June. So in a March investigation into Israeli use of white phosphorus in South Lebanon, Al Jazeera was told by Lebanese experts that Israel was attempting to create a buffer zone by making the region uninhabitable and impossible to cultivate. So agriculture accounts for up to 80% of South Lebanon's gross domestic product, according to the United Nations. Al Jazeera's investigation found that Israel had dropped 117 phosphoric bombs on southern Lebanon, striking at least 32 towns and villages between October and March. The impacted area spanned nearly the entirety of Lebanon's 100-kilometer, 62-mile southern border. So Israel's repeated use of white phosphorus has drawn the ire of international rights organizations. On March 19th, Oxfam and Human Rights Watch called on the Biden administration to, quote, immediately suspend arms transfers to Israel. The documented use of white phosphorus has renewed calls from rights organizations to close the loopholes that they see it used in populated areas. So the HRW report says that Israel's widespread use of white phosphorus in South Lebanon highlights the need for stronger international law on incendiary weapons. The HRW report urged Lebanon to file a declaration with the International Criminal Court to enable an investigation and prosecution, quote, of grave international crimes on Lebanese territory since October of last year. So neither Lebanon nor Israel are members of the ICC. The court would need a formal declaration from one of the parties to investigate. Lebanon recently walked back an earlier statement that it would give the ICC jurisdiction to investigate Israeli war crimes on its territory post-October 7th. Lebanon's caretaker government voted in April for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to file such a declaration of jurisdiction. When the decision was withdrawn, some analysts speculated that Lebanese parties feared an ICC investigation might also hold them liable. Now, Israel has a history of using white phosphorus in Lebanon, leading credence to the buffer zone theory, according to observers. So Mohammed Hussein, head of South Lebanon's agricultural union, told Al Jazeera in March, quote, the Israeli army targeted civilians with white phosphorus in the 1982 invasion. Since October 7th, there's been a lot of white phosphorus used on forests, plantations, olive, and fruit trees. There were also documented uses of white phosphorus munitions during Israel's siege of western Beirut in 1982. Now, after rights groups accused Israel of war crimes for its use of white phosphorus during its war on Gaza in 2008 and 2009, the Israeli military said that it would stop using its smokescreen munitions in built-up areas with unspecified exceptions. Stronger international standards against the use of white phosphorus are needed to ensure these weapons do not continue to endanger civilians, Kais said. Israel's recent use of white phosphorus in Lebanon should motivate other countries to take immediate action toward this goal. We've also seen reports of white phosphorus being used in Gaza as well. This is very interesting, of course. I mean, it's when they use this, as they mentioned in the report, on agricultural land, it's just absolutely devastating, and can make, I forget exactly what the data is, but it's basically unusable and no longer arable for, I think, decades. And this is so the buffer zone theory makes a lot of sense. But these are just horrible war crimes. I mean, dozens of towns this has been used in, and municipalities, and we've seen nearly 200 people injured with this. These largely, these largely banned weapons. I mean, it's just absolutely unacceptable. But we've seen the U.S. and many of its allies and partners use white phosphorus, and the Israelis do it, pretty regularly. And so this is just, absolutely disgraceful. And I hope the Lebanese government does decide to give the ICC jurisdiction, because it would just be another real it would be another great, even better way to continue to pressure Israel and the United States and the international community to bring a case for war crimes committed in Lebanon, to put a stop to this. So, or just add more pressure on the administration here and in Tel Aviv. Okay, so this next stories are from Jason Ditz, keeping us up to date on the tit for tat strikes back and forth, Israeli bombings in Lebanon, and then retaliatory strikes from Hezbollah. So Israeli airstrikes kill 4 in southern Lebanon. This is from June 9th from Jason Ditz. Israeli warplanes carried out multiple airstrikes against southern Lebanon over the weekend, killing at least 4 people. 2 of them reported to be Hezbollah members. 5 civilians were also reported to be injured in the attacks. An attack struck a house in the southern town of Hula, killing the 2 Hezbollah members and wounding 3 civilians. Israel also claimed to have bombed a missile platform in Hula. A second strike took place in the village of Aitarun, where 2 air-to-surface missiles were fired at a marketplace, targeting a coffee shop inside a gas station. The owner of the coffee shop, identified as Ali Kali Hamad, was killed, along with a young man named Mustafa Isa. The Aitarun attack killed the 2 civilians and also wounded 2 others. The attacks caused extensive damage to the gas station and the coffee shop, along with nearby shops and houses. Israel termed the Atun attack as one against, quote, a piece of infrastructure. Yeah, those coffee shops and gas stations, you've really got to make sure to wipe those out. While reporting myriad other strikes across Lebanon's south, mostly artillery strikes against the source of rocket fire from the area. So Hezbollah carried out an attack with rockets and explosive drones against the Golan Heights, hitting open areas and starting a fire which Israeli fighters struggled to contain. Firefighters struggled to contain. Rockets were also fired against the Galilee Panhandle, and anti-tank missiles were fired on Malkia and Misgaf Am. And then this last story from Jason Ditz on June 10th, Israeli missile strikes kill 5, including 3 Hezbollah along the Lebanon-Syria border. Of course, we've seen Israel ramp up its strikes in Israel as well over the last month, seeing sometimes 2 or 3 per week, up, which is worse than their usual rate of once a week, even before October 7th, for years and years, going back to 2012. And throughout the whole dirty war against Damascus. But Jason writes here, Israeli missiles targeted a convoy of tankers crossing the Syrian border into Lebanon today, killing at least 5 people and wounding 5 others. 3 of those killed were reportedly Syrian members of Hezbollah. 2 Lebanese not affiliated with Hezbollah were also killed. So Israel fired 9 missiles at the convoy, causing substantial damage and casualties among both those ferrying the tankers across the border and bystanders. At least 5 were reported as wounded and 2 as missing. The attacks took place in the Hermel district of northeast Lebanon along the Syrian border. Israel is yet to comment on the matter, and what information there is has come from Lebanese security sources and from the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, which backs the opposition against Assad. So it's unclear whether the primary targets were the tankers or the Hezbollah members. It's also not clear why tankers would be targeted. building was also reportedly hit. Earlier in the day, Hezbollah reported and Israel confirmed the shootdown of a Hermes 900 Israeli drone. The drone was armed to carry out attacks, but also had been used to conduct surveillance. It was shot down over southern Lebanon. New reports out of southern Lebanon portray a bleak situation, both for the tens, perhaps 100,000 civilians who fled the war-torn area, as well as for those who stayed behind. Southern Lebanon, mostly an agricultural area, has sustained major damage during the past 8 months of Israeli attacks, and locals fear a worsening situation as attacks escalate. And of course, we've seen reports of the British warning Lebanon that Israel is going to be starting a full-scale war with well, they make no differentiation. In fact, you can see like former Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, when he's on American television, just boasts that, well, look, Hezbollah is a part of the Lebanese government, so we're going to replicate the kind of destruction we've wreaked in Gaza in Lebanon and go to war with the state of Lebanon, the people of Lebanon. And the warning, according to these reports, is that the British are saying that this is going to happen at some point in the middle of June, so it could be days away. As I've mentioned before, Israel was already committing what even the world court says is plausibly a genocide for months and months and months now. And now, as we've seen this ICJ ruling calling for them to halt their operations in Rafah, and the ICC announcement, Karim Khan, the chief prosecutor, that he's going to be seeking arrest warrants for Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant, the defense minister of Israel, as well as some members of Hamas, political leaders, and so forth, and military leaders. We've seen Israel become even more erratic and more ruthless and macabre in their attacks. I mean, dressing up as displaced Palestinians to go into the Nusriat refugee camp, and then murdering hundreds of civilians, using an aid truck to almost Trojan horse their way into the area and to start murdering Palestinians. They even reportedly killed some Israeli hostages during the operation, but we're supposed to celebrate the fact that they rescued 4 people at the cost of at least 274, nearly 300 Palestinian lives, and almost 700 or more than that wounded. And so we can just see, I mean, even from these strikes on Rafah with American bombs, or the UN school in central Gaza that was hit with 2 American bombs that even CNN reported because they found, footage of the debris of the bombs. I mean, just imagine what this looks like to the rest of the world, and particularly the Arab street. I mean, most of these regimes are bought off by the U.S., and we see more and more indications that, I think it's more or less a fool's errand, that this idea that Blinken and Sullivan and Biden are so committed to this normalization deal with Saudi Arabia. I don't think it's going to be possible at all with Netanyahu in power, at least, because there's just no way he's going to end this war, agree to a ceasefire, and certainly not a Palestinian state, or any progress, any substantive agreement to work toward a Palestinian state. And so in the meantime, we're really just seeing Israel diplomatically pushed into a corner and becoming ever more isolated and even more of a pariah state than it arguably already was before October 7th. And they're lashing out and murdering civilians by the hundreds and hundreds every week in the most brutal fashion. All our, leadership class can say is that it's self-defense and that we stand with Israel. So they may be saying that about Lebanon soon as well.
All right, Connor, thank you for the update, and we'll be back with more later in the week. Thanks, Connor.
Thank you, Kyle. Thank you, everybody.